So my name, we're recording. Yeah, so my name's Laura Dix. I've spent the last kind of almost 15 years working in the women's sector in the UK. I've done various roles, from working in refuges, running groups, running training, but a lot of roles where I've managed projects. Until quite recently, I actually struggled with calling myself a project manager. I always just thought I'm someone who manages projects, but I'm not a project manager. And I think I started reflecting on why that was a couple of years ago. And I think it's partly because I don't feel like a typical project manager. I think I'm someone who's a bit quieter, someone who's quite reflective and kind of thrives on things being sort of at a slower pace. I also remember doing a role as a global project manager and being told, you're not telling us off, you're not being strict enough, you're not, pushing us, boom, boom, boom. And I found that quite difficult to work out where I fit within that, because I am somebody who wants to think about deadlines and what works for everybody. And so, yeah, I wanted a space to feel kind of more myself and be able to bring who I was and the different skills, maybe as someone who's a bit quieter. And at the same time, with the projects that I was either managing or part of, like the project team, I actually saw myself making some mistakes in the projects, or saw particular gaps in the way that things were being delivered. So I found that it didn't feel like there was much time to reflect in the projects. There wasn't much time for self-care. Some of the ones that I worked on myself, like I said, or others aren't or weren't sort of built around the most marginalized people. Specifically with the work that I do around domestic abuse, we work with a lot of trauma, and a lot of the staff maybe themselves have experienced trauma, as well as the service users that we're running projects with and for. So I was thinking about actually some of the projects that weren't that trauma informed in the way that they were run. And models, some of you might be familiar with things like Prince 2 and PMBOK. They just didn't feel like they fit with running kind of social justice projects, and people's lives felt messy, timeframes felt messy. So I wanted a space to be able to work differently. And I reached out to COFEM just with some ideas and wanting to explore feminist project management and what that looked like. And specifically, there was lots and lots of talk around feminist leadership. So it was very much thinking, well, what does that look like in a project management space? So COFEM were amazing, and they connected me up with Jana, and the rest is history. So I'm going to pass over to Jana now to talk about her sort of journey to where we are today.
Thanks for that introduction, Laura. And yeah, I'm really excited, well, I guess, to finally be at a point to also launch our learning brief today. And also super excited to see that there's so much interest in this topic. My name is Jana Visser. I work as an independent feminist consultant, project manager, and researcher. And basically managing projects is inherent to the way I work as an independent consultant. So managing projects in a feminist or an inclusive way has always been a question that has been on the forefront of my work. And also over the years, I really noticed that when I reflected upon projects I managed, I sometimes could feel really good about it, even if not all project objectives were met. While at other instances, we could meet all project objectives, but then the process would leave me with like a bad taste. So when Laura reached out to explore the concept of feminist project management further, it felt like it really came at the right time. So I think it has almost been 2 years that Laura and I have been on this exploratory journey together. Yeah, and we are looking forward to sharing some of our learnings on this through both the learning brief as well as through today's panel discussion, but also to learn more from everyone that's here today attending the event. So we started 2 years ago with facilitating a learning circle on feminist project together with COFEM. And after that, we felt that there was so much more to explore, to rethink, to learn. So we engaged in many conversations with other project members, with COFEM members. I think some of the people we have spoken to over the past 2 years are also attending today. And this in the end has resulted in a learning brief that we are launching today. And before moving on to introducing our 2 panelists of today, we briefly want to highlight what we mean by feminist project management and some of the main themes of our learning brief. So I'm gonna ask Iris if yes, he's already sharing the screen. I hope you're all able to see it. Yeah, so what do we mean by feminist project management? I think for us, it means feminist leadership in action, kind of in the same way that feminist leadership pushes us for changes in our approach to leadership. Feminist project management offers us a transformative way of facilitating project delivery. And to put it simply, it's a way of managing projects differently and thereby challenging some of the mainstream models of project management that Laura also just referred to. So we really see it that feminist project management can guide us in transforming management, but also realize that feminist leadership in practice, and thereby creating systems and structures that work for everyone involved in a project, and also allow for different ways of developing project management, depending on the context in which your work is situated. Could you kindly put the next slide on, Iris? Thank you. So I guess all projects are different, and maybe I am disappointing a lot of people at the start of this event by saying that we don't believe that there's one set in stone approach to feminist project management, but we really don't think there is. However, we do believe that there are certain practices and values that are key in practicing feminist project management. And that is also what we are going to zoom in on today. We really see feminist project management as an ongoing process of learning and unlearning, both individually and collectively. And I think one of our main points in the learning brief is the importance of being intentional, and then specifically around the three elements that we put on the slide. So around process and progress, accountability and collaboration, and transparency in decision-making power. And with our panelists, we are going to explore what these concepts mean by looking at some good practice examples, but also what challenges do we face and what mistakes have we made maybe. So Iris, I would like to ask you to, yes, great. And yeah, then I also want to welcome Hera and Priya, our two panelists of today. And I would like to ask the both of you to briefly introduce yourselves and maybe share a bit on what has been your personal journey into feminist project management. Maybe Priya, we can start with you.
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Priya Dhanani. So nice to see a lot of familiar names and faces. I just started my PhD at Monash University under the Center for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and Girls, and formerly was the assistant director at the Asia Foundation overseeing the gender-based violence portfolio. You know, I would say that the process has been messy, and I'm starting to embrace that it's going to continue to be messy. I think one of the things that came up for me in this question that you asked is that I didn't really think that I had the power to do anything when it came to project management, and in terms of using feminist principles. I worked at an organization formerly that was started by women and that was considered feminist, and found it incredibly harmful for women of color. I found the principles to be really unsafe. And that got me thinking, well, if you call yourself feminist, does it make it so? And what power do I have in those instances to make change, whether it's for my own team or for myself and how I show up in those spaces? And so feminist leadership was something that I thought a lot about, and not just even the management, but what were the day-to-day approaches and the principles of an organization that allows myself and a team to manage a project in a way that's inclusive and equitable. And so that has really been sort of my journey, this one step forward, two steps back of trying to implement ways and thinking something might work, and also recognizing when it doesn't, which I'll get into a little bit more. And one thing that I wanted to say, and I think that this has come up quite a bit, but when we personally feel that we don't have the power, that's quite internalized patriarchy. And that is something that I have thought a lot about in personal change and growth and working in more feminist ways. So not just, ensuring that it's in practice, but what I'm doing and what I'm saying that also matches, with how I think the team should work.
Thanks so much, Priya, for your introduction.
And yeah, I'd love to go next. That was really interesting, Priya. And yeah, I'm here to learn from everybody, like we said in the beginning of the event, and also share more about me. So I'm Hera Hussain. I'm the founder and CEO of Chen. It's an organization I started 10 years ago that creates resources for survivors of gender-based violence across the world around healing from trauma. And it's in 14 languages. It's a truly global initiative. Ran it as a volunteer for 7 years while working in tech companies and also tech nonprofits. And sort of my journey into feminism has been very much from the doing and learning by doing rather than kind of reading. I actually have zero history in like any sort of like feminist sort of literature or work. And then went full-time on Chen 3 years ago and have basically, as the boss, have the opportunity to put things in place and give my staff and also the volunteers of our organization, because we still have lots and lots of volunteers. It's a hybrid organization, lots of room to sort of play and decide how we want the projects to run. And just experimentation. So like Priya said, a lot of messiness. I definitely find that the moment you attach something like feminist to anything, you're kind of setting yourself up for failure because the systems we live in are so rigid. And they're so it's really hard to work against what is considered best. But my approach has always been that I try to learn from all the environments I've been in, whether that was tech spaces and agile methodologies, which we follow at Chen. We try to mold what works for different sectors into how it would work for us. So we sort of work across our principles. And I'll share more about that in the chat so you can learn more. But yeah, I'm really interested to sort of share how we've done this in a distributed online team, which has both paid members of staff and then unpaid volunteers who all work together in this hybrid sort of distributed power and decision-making global operation. And a lot of our staff and volunteers are survivors of abuse, up to 70%. So we have an extra layer of ensuring that the way we work is trauma-informed, and people carry a lot of personal pain and experiences into the work, which we have to be mindful of and work along.
Thank you so much for those introductions. And yeah, thank you so much, Hera and Priya, for your time. We are going to move into kind of a bit more of a panel discussion now, but we would love, as we've written in the agreements around the space, we would love to hear from you all in the chat. Please ask questions, talk about your own experiences, comment, and we'll try and bring in some of your thoughts and comments and questions as we go. So this event is actually about launching the learning brief. So after this, it will be kind of publicly available, but we're going to talk a little bit more now about some of the practices. We wanted to try and make the session really practical in things that you can take away and start using today, but also some of the challenges around particular approaches. So Jan has already talked a little bit about the learning brief and being sort of this idea that there is no one set in stone approach to feminist project management, and a lot of it is around learning and specifically unlearning as well some of the practices, both as an individual and as a collective. But we felt that, again, we're only at the start of this journey, it feels, and really sort of bottoming out what this project management looks like in terms of bringing in feminist leadership. But we felt that there's certain overarching themes. And the first one of those is thinking about being intentional about the process. So in some of the projects that we've worked on, we often felt like there's not much attention being paid to how we meet the project outcomes. And it often feels like progress is really prioritized over the process. But if we focus only on the sort of the progress, we might meet our goals, but we get to the end of the project and we might find ourselves completely exhausted with a worn out staff team, or maybe even no team left at all. A sense that along the way, we've not really had space to unpack, reflect, celebrate successes, or learn from mistakes. And we may even find that we've managed a project that's actually maintained or even kind of reinforced structures of oppression, and what those that kind of mimic existing power imbalances, privileges. So for us, a big part of feminist project management is focusing on the journey just as much as the destination, and ensuring that at each step of the way, the project and how it's set up and the structure means that we're really kind of living into those feminist leadership principles. So we're going to sort of lean into the first question for the panelists. So Priya and Hira, could you talk a little bit about your thoughts and experiences about focusing on the process as much as progress within a project? And it would be great to hear about times you've been really intentional about the process, and what some of the challenges are in taking this approach. So either of you, feel free to jump in and go first.
I can go. I think it's a very interesting way that you've sort of phrased it, the question around how we can focus on the process as much as the progress. I would say I don't think of it like that. I'm going to be controversial. I believe progress is really important in our spaces. It's just that I've been in spaces where people only think about process and nothing ever gets done. And then I've been in spaces where people only think about progress and not about the process, and it's super messy and stressful, and you're like, just like feel like you're turbocharging into the work and not really like having any stability. So I believe progress is really important, but it's just that the process needs to be the foundation on which the progress is made. So I don't really see them, I don't know if I see them as equally important. They probably are equally important, but it depends on what we're looking at. So for Chen, we focus a lot on planning and reflection. And in the document that I shared, you can see that it's, we have 4 staff retreats during the year. We have retrospectives after every project. Every quarter we meet and we reflect on like what went right, what we can do better. We look back at the process and what we can improve, and we do improvements in real time. So I'm a big believer in doing improvements in real time rather than waiting till the end of a process to do so, which is why I like processes to be nimble and flexible. So, we decided in our planning week that we were going to do something like this, and it turns out that it's not really working. We're not going to wait until the end of it. We will respond like in real time to make that change. So it's like also by keeping planning heavy at the beginning, but then leaving space during during the length of a project to be responsive and reactive. I think it's like one of the best decisions I feel that I've made in the organization, and like having that nimbleness, which allows you to respond really quickly. But even with that, things will go wrong and things will be difficult, and you're not sure what the best way is, which is why a reflective practice is so important. It means that it's less of a this was this person's fault, and it's more of a this didn't work, and having a learning approach to work while having accountability, but like making sure that everybody feels like the space is there's space to own up to what hasn't worked, to come up with different ideas, to have an experimental approach. So when we try different experiments, we track them. We're like, okay, as an example, for like recruitment is a really highly resource intensive activity. And it's one that we've struggled with. We've tried so many different things to make it like, less administrative while still being a high quality, inclusive process. So that's one that we track really heavily. Another thing is like how many project meetings we have. I feel like sometimes when we're trying to be inclusive, we overcompensate for it, and meetings is a big one. It takes up a lot of space from people's times. If you're working in multi-time zones, it creates and actually getting teams to be having good enough communication and project management within a team that people can rely on each other and over communicate. I'm a big fan of over communicating via like written communication. having more regular communication is much better than having lots and lots of project meetings, because what we find is that it takes up so much emotional and mental space that people have less time to actually do the work. So actually like helping people understand what is something that we need consensus for, what is something that you can make a directive action for because you are in charge, you can do that. What are things that you need a lot of ideas on, like just having different modes in the organization and people feeling comfortable into like tapping into it. And yeah, it's a really good point by Alison about accountability and decision making. Absolutely. And I find that even with all the work that Jen does, we still find staff feel like they need our permission, like senior staff's permission to do stuff. So we're actually just trialing a new thing within the organization, which is like making people write down what they think they have like veto power on, what they think they can just move ahead with, what they need consensus on. And then we make them fill out a chart, and then their line managers are working with them on that to be like, let's look at your job description. And then what turns out, a lot of people, even though they have the power, because they've been in spaces where even though they have the, they may not have had the power, or even if they have had the power, the culture has made it so that they haven't been able to practice it. They bring that into like an organization where we want them to use their power, but they're not doing it because if that muscle hasn't had any practice, you know, it's out of it needs that encouragement. So that's been really helpful actually, because we were like, okay, we actually, our project managers have a lot of like power. Why are they coming back to like the senior management again for these decisions? And that really helped me understand actually it's not just about what we do as an organization, it's about the kind of culture people bring with them because they've had 10 years of experience or 7 years of experience of working in other organizations. And that's what default is for them. So when they enter a different culture, even though things feel different, part of my job as a leader is to like make it really clear to them that it's for them, like they have that decision-making role and they can do it, and to remind them of that again and again. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that comes up for me first is that there's this assumption that everybody understands what a feminist way of working is, and that everybody understands how to, you know, manage a team or to manage a project. And that is something, you know, we put people in leadership positions once they've been at an organization long enough, rather than thinking about whether the person has the skills to be able to manage people. Same thing with feminist leadership or feminist project management. We think that, oh, because somebody has worked in feminist spaces, or I don't know, that I've done women and gender studies as a degree, that automatically makes me a feminist who's able to work in these spaces. And so one of the start off points that I think is really, really important is one, creating space where we're learning and creating those opportunities where we can learn not only the organizational culture that you're coming into, but building some of these skills. They really are skills. They're a new and different way of thinking. And just because you've worked in it, or just because I'm even talking about this, doesn't mean that I don't have to think about it at every minute to make sure that I get it right, or that I back up when I don't. And so that is one of the things that I think is incredibly important in terms of creating process, is to have people who can who feel like they have the space to learn, to be able to recognize how to implement the process. The second thing that I really want to note is that the way that project management usually happens, or the way that projects come about, is quite structured and almost created for us. When you're working within an organization, you know, the donors create the goals and the objectives and the timelines, and you know, fill out these proposals. You might reach out to 1 or 2 people in a country or a region. You come up with what they are already doing, and then you take the project to them and say, this is what we want you to do. And then expect a different outcome, or to expect, you know, what do we say, progress. And where it's been possible, we've tried to turn this on its head. So I recognize that there is so much going on at one time. And if you want to be feminist, you want to be inclusive and equitable, it takes a lot of time. It really takes slowing down. And that's so hard to do when you feel like everything should have been done yesterday. But slowing down and talking to the people who this project or program is going to impact, they are your co-creators, not, the team is only a small part of that. And so how do we co-create with those that the program is going to be impacting? And so in one of the ways that I've done this is that to actually turn it around, to give them a proposal. So not where they turn one in to us, but that we're reaching out to organizations to say, this is what we generally think that the issue is and that we want to achieve. Are we off base? What do you need? What should we be looking at? Who needs to be at the table? Because people know what they need. They are very aware of their, of their challenges. And it doesn't always line up with the donor, but we try our best to sort of massage the language and what that needs to look like. But the buy-in happens at the very beginning of that project. And I think that is such a big part of the process. And ensuring that the team also recognizes that decision-making isn't just by us and sharing between us, but also survivors and the communities that we're working with.
Thank you for those thoughts. And I can see the chat with the audience, and there's loads of stuff about people saying that they really agree, really important points. Everything that you're saying is really resonating. So just to kind of cover back. So I think the first thing that I wanted to speak to is just about Hera, your comment just about saying that for you, progress is really important as well, if not more important. And I think one of the things that I wanted to highlight is that there is no one size fits all when it comes to project management. And I think we're often told that, things like Prince 2, it's like there should be one project manager who holds all of the power and there's a particular set way of doing it. But, it is about leaning into what feels right for your organization. And we'll talk a bit later about decision making and sharing power and things like that. And that can look completely different. And how you're sort of stepping into that locally is really interesting. And then here, I think you talked about that to me is really fascinating about how you're sort of giving people power, how they're taking it, where people are working out what their decision-making ability is and what their sort of level of I guess, autonomy is. And Priya, you talked a bit about assumptions and does everybody even understand feminism or leadership and the skills that you need? And having space for learning. I think the bit that's really interesting for me definitely is about the pace. And we met previously and talked a lot about pace actually and what that looks like in different organizations. But I think that will resonate with a lot of people. And somebody's written in the chat, the system in place doesn't allow for this most of the time. A lot of times these timeframes are set by our donors and our funders. So we are working at a pace, but actually to be able to do this in a feminist way does mean sort of slowing down and creating those spaces. So I would really encourage people in the chat to kind of keep writing questions, keep writing comments. But yeah, I wondered if there's anything else that you wanted to think about in terms of pace. Oh, and there's a couple of questions here about pace. Intersectional approaches to pace and urgency, notions of queer time and CRIP time. I've not heard of that before. CRIP are very important to feminist project management. Yeah, Layla, I'd love to know more about what CRIP time is. And it's, somebody's talking about a certification that's quite different. It's been a breath of fresh air. I'll look that up. That sounds really interesting. Yeah, is there more that you wanted to say, Priya and Hera, just about anything that we've talked about so far, pace, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, pace is a very interesting challenge. I feel like pace is one that I struggle in the sense that when you're a small charity working in a global, for a global level, and everybody, so actually I've written a lot about pace in the link that I posted. You'll see what it's like to work at Chen. There's a whole section on pace, because I find that everybody has a different assumption of what a pace of a charity should be like. And it's not one that I ascribe to, because I feel like you were saying, it depends on the organization, it depends on the kind of work it's doing, kind of pace it sets. So I think the organization has to set a pace, and then the individuals that join the organization, we have to make sure that they are the best for that pace, and also that the organization has enough room to adjust to the individual when needed. So whether that is, if someone is in our work, we have to make space for vicarious trauma. We have to make space for people, being triggered at work. So we have to account for that. But in general, we run a very fast-paced organization. But for someone who works in like charity spaces, we'll find it quite fast-paced. But when we have colleagues joining us from the tech space, they're like, this is really good. This is fast-paced, but we have all these benefits. And they can't believe like all the space we have for rest. So it's really interesting. I get such different readings from different people who join, which is why I believe in transparency. So I've written up pretty much everything about how it is like to work in the organization, what our expectations are. We are very big on documentation and rest. We have 3 weeks that the staff get. They're only expected to work 1/3 of the time during between end of December and start off January. We do a 4-day working week. We have flexible hours. And the idea is that people work when they feel they're most productive, but that the time that they work, they do good work and productive work, so that the time that they have for rest, that they can truly rest. And we don't want people to bleed into that time. So we want them to not do overtime, but the time that they're working, yes, it's going to be fast-paced. We have a host of well-being benefits that we offer. So yeah, I find the conversation of space needs a lot more nuance around that. And the best thing that I can do as a leader is I find that I can push back on some of that donor and partner deliverables, which I try to do as much as I can. So we say no to anything over December, for example. December is our reflection time, and then we have our winter break, things like that. We have purposeful, intentional periods of rest. And then by dividing the year into quarters and doing a retreat at the end of every quarter and the start of the next quarter, it means that nobody does any work in that week. It's a planning week, it's a reflection week. It gives us a chance to think about, we said we were going to do all of this. Is that realistic? And we find that people are so ambitious at the start of the quarter. And then when we do the reflection, they're like, oh yeah, no, we're pretty sure we cannot do 1/3 of this. And it's about being like, okay, we can't do this. And let's like move things over. So we only plan for 2 quarters in advance. And the idea is that people only plan for like the first quarter of the year, you plan for 80 to 90%. Second quarter, you plan for like 60 to 70%. And everything after that should be very like 30, 40%, because things are going to pop up and we are not going to have full control over it. So we need to leave space for that, like new projects coming up, new partnerships, new campaigns, extreme like workload, many survivors finding us all of a sudden, nothing we can control, and we're going to have to respond. That kind of thing. I think just like acknowledging which periods we know are going to be busy and making sure other periods are not as busy, and we're not filling them in with stuff just because they look empty. It's never going to be empty. So just having the team to have that discipline, and it's a conversation. It's the same conversation at every retreat where we're like, did we overpromise ourselves? Yes, we did. Okay, let's plan better for the next one. And I think it's like an organizational muscle actually to get that practice in there and be like, okay, we need to be more realistic about some of these timelines, and also leave space for spontaneity. I think that we need to be more positive about some of this conversation on workloads, because I want my staff to have time to be like, if a partner comes to us and says, we're doing this project, we would love your help, I don't want to turn to them and say, actually, no, because we've booked ourselves for the next 3 months. That doesn't feel like a good ecosystem player approach to me. So I want them to have that time to be like, yes, we left time for this. And yeah, let's do this. It's like spontaneity and like being having good solidarity across the sector. So that's why I like leaving space for doing nothing, because I know it's going to get filled up anyway, but with like interesting things that just come along our way.
I think my team and I got so used to saying we're behind. And at one meeting, we were in a circle and we were like, working and ending violence against women and girls, we're always going to feel behind. It's always too much work that not enough to carry one team member described it as being in a boat with a hole in it and just constantly taking the water out. And that, I think, is something that was really powerful, that it always feels that way. And so as much as that we try to say no, or that some of the, you know, incredible things that you've put in place, it's like, no matter how many ways you try, it's almost this trying not to feel exhausted, one, by the issue, and second, by the work. They're both incredibly heavy. It's not, you know, you do a few hours and you've been working in an issue on working with survivors or case management, and then you go home with that, and you know, it's on your brain while you sleep, and it's incredibly heavy. You know, our project management isn't just something that's simple that we can just let go of when we make it home. And so I think that is something important to think about, that is that weighs a lot longer and heavier because of the areas that we work in and how much empathy and compassion that requires of us. And as a survivor and as survivors, it can be something that comes up even more depending on what the case is and what the work is. So in terms of pace, I think it's really important to know that there's work, and then that this isn't just something that's separate from who we are. This impacts every woman, every AFAB, you know, person that I know, that we are constantly having to deal with this on the personal side. And so where we can, I think we've tried to work with the teams to say, not only to say no and to say that we can't take this work, but to also create relationships and partnerships with other organizations that might have more resources, and have the ability to maybe take on something that we can't. So just because we say no doesn't mean it's a stop, but that there's a partner or there's an organization that might be able to take it on. I know even as a consultant, I've done this with other consultants where we collaborate on a specific thing, or we bring in a consultant to support a specific part of work. You know, I talked about more challenges than I did solutions in this, and I'm interested in hearing from others, because I think it's a constant thing that I think I'm still struggling with, of how to manage pace.
No, yeah, thanks for sharing that reflection, Priya. And I think so, like the personal side and the collaborations also with other organizations, and a bit of sharing the accountability in that as well. I think will also resonate with a lot of people in the audience. I saw some really interesting questions coming in as well, in terms of hearing more about how you empower also more junior staff and volunteers to challenge practices that don't work for us. But also, how do you work with organizations that might have different structures that aren't as feminist as we would like it to be? And I think that also kind of links really well to the second practice we discuss in the learning brief, which is more focused on being intentional about how to encourage collaboration whilst also creating a sense of shared accountability in that. And I think in the brief, we explore what it means to manage projects in an inclusive way in which everyone can participate, but that part of that is also around how you work with others. And if you're also able to offer them what they need to be able to collaborate. So that can look different, I think, in every project within every organization. But also, how do you create that shared accountability, and how do you hold yourself and others also accountable in that sense? So maybe Hira and Priya, also for you, like, can you speak a bit more also to accountability and collaboration within project management? And I think that can be both within the organization, but also in collaboration with other organizations, and kind of how you foster collaboration that's that kind of links back to both individual as well as collective accountability.
Priya, you want to go first? I feel like I'm always going first.
That's okay, Hera. I think we're just going back and forth. I think in terms of accountability, I've tried to create feedback loops within the teams that I've managed or within teams that I'm on and not necessarily managing, but have constantly asked the question of what are the processes in a safe way where people feel comfortable enough to be able to give feedback. And I don't mean doing a check-in and saying, please let me know how you feel about an issue. I don't think that's always a fair way to get feedback, especially if you don't feel safe or comfortable in a very hierarchical organization. And so thinking of anonymous ways, for example, on my last team, we created an anonymous form and you were able to put comments on that form and you could put questions in there and you could talk about specific projects or things, did not have to name yourself, but it was a way that people who maybe did not feel comfortable speaking up within a meeting or a specific one-on-one conversation were able to do. I wouldn't say that it always held everybody accountable, but it did allow for a lot of conversation. And I think it also brought up a lot of issues around transparency that weren't always noticed, to be honest. So sometimes you're thinking that you're being as transparent and sharing power, and you might recognize that somebody on the team may not feel that way. And so it always allows for reflection for us to be able to go back and say, okay, what didn't we do right? And what could we have done better? I also think that that's incredibly important for partners and for those that we're working with, to also have a way to give feedback on how we work. It's rare that you ask, especially local partners or organizations that you're working on a specific project. How did we do? What could we have done better? What questions should we ask? Did you feel like you had the power to be able to make decisions? Did you feel that everybody who was supposed to be at the table was at the table? And this isn't an end of the project evaluation, but this is something that consistently and quarterly, these surveys are sent out. They're about 3 to 4 questions and really gave perspective. I think we're really quick to get numbers and then applaud ourselves on the work we did. And sometimes our accountability to feminist project management and approaches is sort of pushed to the side when we're thinking so goal heavy. And again, this goes back to the pace. Sometimes it makes it really difficult to pause and reflect about how a relationship might be equitable or how it's inequitable and what we need to be doing more of. So I find that is something that's might be quick and also allows for deeper conversation and accountability.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I would say that our experience with anonymous feedback is actually quite different. And I think it's because, Jen is a small organization. And we actually had anonymous feedback, which we took away because we found that there was racial and people felt more empowered to say stuff that they would never say to someone on their face because it would clearly be so inappropriate. And I received the brunt of it because I was, I'm a brown woman leading an organization where my staff was at that time mostly white and my volunteers are extremely diverse. So so we actually took that away and have now our review is people have to be comfortable in saying that if they have a complaint, we have an anonymous process for complaints. But the culture we want to have in our organization is that if someone has a concern with their peer, that they should feel comfortable, that our culture should be so that they feel comfortable bringing that up with them one-to-one or with their line manager and have that conversation and have that conversation with kindness and care at the heart of it. But it's important that in the space that we're creating, where we're thinking about intersectionality, we're thinking about the fact that we are living in a global inequity, people extend care to all levels of an organization. So, in Gen, a volunteer can end up managing a staff member over a project. A staff member can manage a volunteer. It's very unique in that way that we kind of all work together on things. And there we try to minimize the power imbalance that a lot of organizations have. So we actually don't have that issue. Our board meetings are open to staff and volunteers. They are able to come to it. We have collective peer sessions that are available to staff and volunteers and contractors. So it is one of the feedback that we get is people feel sometimes uncomfortable with how transparent the organization is because they're not used to it. They're not used to the fact that people are so open and like giving positive feedback, but also constructive feedback and being like, I think we could have done this better. What do we think about this? And just having that conversation. So initially when people join, we know that it takes about 3 months of them to adjust into how collaborative and transparent like communication within Chen is, because, and we need it to be because we have a global team, a distributed team, a very small team. So it needs that. In terms of partnerships, is super interesting. I find that the organizations that we partner with that are the most vocal about feminism tend to be the worst ones that we work with. And the more they shout about feminist principles, the least they apply them. And the ones that are like living the values rather than just shouting about them are the ones that are so easy to work with because they hold themselves accountable. They're like, you know what, we didn't do this. And this was the reason. Can we work something out here? Can we do this? And it's just so much more collaborative. So I think a solutions-oriented approach, or even just holding space for complexity, which is devoid of blame, which I think is the hard thing. People like with accountability, people like assigning blame. Also to themselves, I think it's so natural to be like, you know what, I was at fault, or what could I have done better? But then if on a group level, it can get toxic because then everyone's like, well, no, I could have done this, and you're like, no. So we like dispensing that with having a collective approach. So if in our partnerships, we have a guide on how we do partnerships, which we send to our partners, which our staff know, which is like, we will show up with these values, and you know, please like call us out, call us in if you feel like we're not doing this work. And we will explain, and we will do our best. So we hold ourselves to high standards internally and externally, with the knowledge that this work is hard and it's complex, and sometimes things don't work out, and that's okay. But what I really value in staff, volunteers, and partnerships is integrity and transparency. Like I would say these are the two things that I absolutely like. Anything that, if someone does not have integrity, it's really hard to work with them and trust them. And that is where the accountability is so important. Whereas if someone holds themselves with integrity, even in the space where they haven't been able to do what they've promised to do, you are able to work on that relationship because there was honesty in there. It's where there's dishonesty and disingenuousness is where I draw a line, and I cannot work with organizations or people that do not show up with that. So I've learned the hard way that it's okay to sever relationships when people do not have integrity, and organizations cannot do that because it doesn't serve. Like, we are working with less resources on a huge problem. It's so much better to like just not work with people that don't share the same values as you. People don't need to have exact identical values, but there are some foundations that need to be in place. And for me, integrity and transparency are the key ones.
I just wanted to mention one thing that came up as you were talking, that is when I was on the board of an organization, we worked in the Asian Pacific Islander community, and the organization represented the community primarily. And one of the things that came up in terms of also thinking about accountability was cultural humility, the way that people have grown up and how we think about hierarchy and who you can say yes to or no to, has been something that was incredibly important. And I've seen that across, but just in the role on the board of how in that organization, even if we created space for openness and for people to talk, that the way we were raised, you know, even like in an Indian culture, which is very hierarchical, that there's a difficulty to speak out or to disagree, even especially to somebody who's considered your superior. And so that's a really important point of thinking about how people show up and making sure that culture of humility is a part of that. And I think the other is we also had an outline of partnerships that partners had to meet a basic minimum or criteria of values. And if they didn't, then it was a no, including a donor who at the time had said some really harmful things publicly, that we decided to work with staff and the board and come to a mutual decision to not take money. And this is a small organization of 10 people, so that those funds are incredibly critical at that level. But I think that part of that saying no and why we said no, we tried to use it as a teaching moment. And I think that those are things that I've seen across that other organizations do as well. And it's really important to abide by your own feminist principles when partnering or accepting money from donors.
Thanks so much both for reflecting a bit more on the accountability part. And I think Hera, also what you were saying in terms of integrity and transparency, and I think Priya, you as well came back to that in terms of that at one point you need to have at least a similar way of working, or at least your values have to be somewhere in line to also continue certain collaborations. And I think the example you just mentioned, Priya, of saying no to a certain funder or donor is, I think, also an act that's really powerful in itself already, but at the same time might also come from a certain position of power. I mean, it also depends if you are in a position to say no, right? I think this part of the conversation also sparked a lot of interesting discussions in the chat. So I was thinking maybe we can pick out a few questions also from the chat where you can maybe reflect upon more. So opening the chat, Laura, feel free to come in.
One of the things I was just going to quickly comment on before we go into the chat is I think I've seen a lot of questions about how do we define feminist project management, and it's something Jan and we've been doing this for 2 years and we're still learning around it. We're still trying to get there. We're going to kind of come to that at the end, sort of funneling you through, but I'd be really interested in the meantime for your comments in the chat about what it means to you. We by no means position ourselves the experts in this. We're just kind of trying to create a space for people to come together to actually be able to talk about it. I just wanted to say one of the things that really resonated for me out of that was when we talk about feminist project management, it sounds like, again, there is no one way of doing it. And the example about feedback I thought was really interesting. About here, you took away people's anonymity because it didn't work, but in a different context for Priya, it really worked to give people that sort of safer space to talk. And I think a lot of it is about just trial and error, and then actually having that space to be able to learn about, did that fit for the organization? Did that fit for these particular people in this particular context? But I think what's really important within it is just thinking about whether you are replicating systems of oppression. So I think here you were saying that there was like a racial element that you were seeing that was coming up. So that having that space to be able to look at that and challenge and work in a different way is really important. Yeah, I don't know if there's questions that you felt were important, Janet, or Priya and Hira, you can see the chat as well if there's anything you wanted to pick up on. There's so many interesting questions. I feel really excited reading this.
I was thinking maybe one that I found really interesting. Sophia also posted like, let me check where it is. Or Cecilia posted, how do we challenge also our superiors to apply feminist project management? And I think it of course also depends on the context and the type of organization you are working in, and how strict your organization also is in terms of do people with the same values come in, and how do we adhere to those, and how do you practice that? But maybe you can speak a bit to that, like, do you have examples or practices in terms of how you deal with superiors that don't apply the feminist principles within a project.
It's a great question and an incredibly hard one. And there have been, I think, multiple outcomes for me where I've been in those positions, and for others that where there's safe space and we discuss what to do in these situations. I think part of it is recognizing that in those situations I felt like I was coming from a position of privilege, that if something negative were to happen, that I had a safety net. And so I think that's really important to remember in when I spoke up, that I had that network and I had that ability to fall back on. I think at one point I was retaliated against for speaking out, and in other instances, that I've had people who have really taken it to heart and found different ways of working. It's not that there's been a whole shift or change within an organization or within an individual, but being able to, again, provide feedback and in professional ways, or in the ways that you can to make the smallest change, or even having some consensus within the team and bringing it together to an individual or to a supervisor, I think can be also incredibly important. I try my best to focus on solutions. So if this isn't working, what are the things that could work? What are the things that we could implement that might have a better outcome? And what does that look like? Sometimes feminist project management isn't even a word or a term that has come up within a team or an organization. I can tell you that it hasn't in the past for me, even feminist leadership. And so I think that a lot of organizations have also been doing some reckoning, especially around the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. There have been all these initiatives and push for DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. And I, asked very, very bluntly to our president, how does that differ from feminist principles when we don't use the word feminism? And there really wasn't, there wasn't a response for that. But I think those questions are incredibly important, that our organizations are pushing some of these principles and these initiatives, but not okay with calling it something that might be too activist focused or too bold. I don't know. I guess the F word is, really bad in some spaces still. But I think, we have to be able to say what is feminist principles and when we're working in anti-feminist ways. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that, Brianna. Just keeping an eye out on the chat as well. Some of the participants are also sharing really interesting examples. I think Leila just shared an example also that sometimes from organizations, especially senior leaders in there as well, that they claim that they were donor in stepping up in terms of creating the reflective spaces and the safe spaces that are needed for the work. So I think that's also a really interesting example. And
there's a question, I don't know if you've seen this here, but I think this is really interesting as well. How do we adjust feminist project management to a more restrictive, patriarchal and fear-based hierarchical context without sacrificing the true spirit and nature of feminist project management? And I think there's a lot that you can unpack there around thinking about that fast pace and everything, but also, how do we do that? How do we practice feminist project management in contexts or organizations that may be very difficult? And I know one of our learnings from the learning circle that we did was very much, for some people working in some contexts, this feels really easy. It feels like their bread and butter, and they're still learning and everything to do, but the organization's really set up to work in this way, versus some people where, you know, it feels really like they're pushing back against a tide that is a very difficult place to be. And I think, Priya, we spoke about this previously, but people having that kind of accountability and agency to be able to do that and make the difference in the sphere that they have kind of say over. So yeah, I wondered if you had any thoughts on that question. It's a great question.
I mean, for me, I would say it would be realistic, tiny revolutions is what I would don't set yourself up for failure by expecting to change a lot. And I think it's being part of collective care is extending care to yourself, which is, you know, what is something realistic that I can change in this space or that I can enact. And I think, I mean, I'm a big fan of playing the game, which is that, you know, when you're in systems that, you know, you have very less power on, you think about what power you do have and how can you use the language, you know, classic advocacy tactic, how can you use language that can get through to people and in the way that they understand. So as an example, things around language of productivity, language of resource management. I find it really easy now that I'm a CEO talking to CEOs of much larger organizations, simply because even though I'm sort of holding myself to like a feminist standard, I would say, and we have our own principles, even when I'm talking to organizations where they don't have that, I'm able to connect with them because what they really care about is reaching their goals, making sure their like staff aren't like, most organizations would never say they want their staff to burn out, even if that's what's happening. You know, they'd want effective resource management. So by using the language that they can understand, explaining what I want, rather than beating the drum of feminism on their head, I think about what is the way that I can talk to them that they will understand, that helps me reach my goal. And I can do that. I often offer, and the offer goes to all of you as well. If any of you are having these conversations with your senior management or your trustees or your boards, and you're looking for someone to come and speak about this stuff, I am always available to do that work. I find it easier now to speak their language and, you know, and think about things like, you know, who was I talking to recently? I was talking to someone recently and they were like, oh my God, I was explaining to them what we're doing in the organization. They were like, do you guys even work? Like, because they thought the way I had structured the organization was too nice. And I was like, no, trust me, there's a lot of work that's done. So I then went through all the work that we had achieved like last year. And they were like, they could not believe it. They could not believe on a 4-day working week. And with the tiny budget that we had, we were able to do all that work. And I was like, well, we're able to do that work. And I explained to them the fact that all this nice stuff that they thought was extra enables the staff to do that work. And like all the different like customs and sort of like things that we've developed to work with the volunteers and tapping into people's like passion and expertise. And I was like, this is what's enabling everything. And like it was like talking to a completely different person after that, because it finally clicked for them that for at least for us it was working, because we were thinking about, that's why I was saying before, that progress, I'm not someone who worries about semantics. I don't worry about using words like progress, space. These words don't scare me, because I feel like it's about how those words fit into you, how you make those words work for you, and how, you know, what they mean to you. So none of Chen's like, we don't have a feminist project manager, we just have project managers. We don't have we don't use these terms to describe, but we do practice them. And I find it really helpful way of talking to organizations that don't have that kind of like inherent feminist practice, is to just be like, it's just effective management. Really, what we're doing is effective and fair and kind management. And it's the best use, making the best use of people's like abilities. Sometimes that does mean you have to take a hit. So if you're talking to an organization about how long people should take for mental health leave, for example, that is a tricky topic to talk about, because, you know, from a very crude business perspective, that is cost to the organization. So I think with those kind of things, it becomes harder to use their language. And then you have to talk about principles. And then that I find hard, but I'm still on it. I feel like it's a mission. I have a mission. I need to think about how to make that like, fit into the business narrative. And I feel like I will be successful. I will report back when I'm successful, but I feel like I can do it. So, I think this is a very good challenge for me to mold what I'm doing into in a way that they understand.
I think that I sort of said this a little bit in the beginning in my introduction when we talked about project management and feeling like you have power in whatever position that you're in. Because we're constantly living in a world that's telling us that this isn't how we should be working. And so you're always almost grinding against that. And so finding the smallest of ways, I think, is incredibly important and shouldn't be shouldn't be seen as small. And an example of this is, I asked my team how they like to be appreciated and how they like to be apologized to. And you wouldn't, believe the responses that I got. Like, we all took the 5 love languages, and you only think about that in terms of romantic relationships, but it was really, really important to know how people like to be appreciated. And sometimes, somebody on your team writes an incredibly difficult email, and that email probably took an hour to put together, and nobody noticed it, and the email went out. But like, just a simple response to say, thank you so much for writing that and for spending time on it. It doesn't sometimes take all of these really grand gestures and big systems. Those are important, but I think helping people feel comfortable and safe in where they're working is super important. And some of those are just the small interactions and knowing how people show up. We try to show up as our true selves. That may not always be the safest way to show up. And so that is also something to navigate, but finding people within the organization that are, other feminists or people that are like-minded, and creating those relationships across organizations is also incredibly important. It will allow you to blow off steam. And also discuss ways. I think Leila and others are putting all these suggestions, but how to sort of build momentum and community within organizations where you do feel safe, where you can share, is something that I've found to be really, really helpful.
Thank you so much. That is beautiful. I completely agree with what people are saying in the comments. It's so lovely. And I'm really glad that we're getting really practical examples as well as talking about a bit more sort of theoretical. We had one more theme to touch on before we can kind of take some more questions, but please do keep putting them into the chat. I'm just going to move on just to the final kind of theme that we'd explored within the learning brief, which was just around decision-making and power. So we touched upon the way that decision-making is organized within a project and how transparent we are upfront about who makes the decisions and who holds the power, and how this has the potential to kind of challenge unequal power structures and relationships in the context in which a project takes place. We also know in the chat that that's not as easy, and sometimes it's projects are set up in a way that we can share power, but other times they are set up in this very sort of mainstream one person leading way. And we also touch a bit about how we can create spaces within projects where others can lead. So Priya and Hira, you've definitely touched on this quite a lot before, and Hira definitely about transparency, but could you talk a bit about decision making within a project and how you share power? So some good examples, and then perhaps what some of the challenges might be, or even some of the mistakes that you might have made previously in projects and what you've learned.
Definitely lots of mistakes. It's a very important principle for Chen. We work with survivors. We don't work for them. Most of our team are survivors. It's a very, very cool, it's a survivor-led organization. So we, a lot of those issues around building projects for an audience that you're not a part of don't really apply to Chen. So that stuff by design we deal with. But I think in terms of, I'm a big, I love distributed power, but I like very clear structures. And I find that when you're managing complex issues, when you have distributed teams, it's really important to have clear structure where people know where they fit in and how they relate to each other. A lot of the issues volunteer-led communities or multicultural communities have is because those structures aren't clear. So we're trial and error over 10 years. We've built those structures for ourselves, so it works. Things like, when what part of a project is consultative, what part of a project isn't consultative. So when project managers can make veto decisions, who needs to be in partnership calls, that kind of stuff is pretty set. How our volunteers are really integral to pretty much all content and product feature related stages is very important to us, because we get our volunteers are a lot more diverse than our staff is very diverse as well, but our volunteers are even more diverse. So we make sure that they're involved in that, and they're not just being shown end results, they're actually part of the design process. So for me, that's sharing power. Even in our governance structure, our volunteers play a role. So for me, that's how I make space for sharing power. But in terms of where I've definitely got it wrong. I would say 2 years ago, I had a huge, I just learned so much from getting it wrong, because what I had so beautifully grown organically in the volunteer community of Chen, when I applied it to short-term contractual relationships, it just fell apart. I felt like I really learned and burned. A lot of people tried to take money from Chen and then didn't do the work. And they felt like because we were a feminist organization, they could bully us by using feminist language. There's a lot of mess and that volunteers, us and staff had to clean up. A lot of time unpaid labor by volunteers had to supplement paid labor, because the paid people just didn't do their work because they liked the ethos of Chen. So they thought they could just get away with not delivering. It was really weird. And I learned a lot from that experience around when that line needs to be drawn very clearly. So our contracts now are really written in a way that are fair to to contractors and employees, but it's very clear the fact that we expect again, talking about integrity is a big part of it, making sure where their responsibilities are and how we expect people to be. And it's something that when we have any major, I would say, negative experience in a work setting, we open that up for reflection to our trustees, to our staff, to our volunteers. And we found last year that we had fallen into a pattern of sharing too much power. I know that feels so weird saying it. We fell into a pattern of sharing too much power with short-term people we were working on a short-term basis. Something about the language that we were using was giving them wrong expectations about how much they could influence the organization. If someone's coming to work with us for 3 weeks, we don't expect them to have a say in how we run the organization. They don't get the chance. They are signing up to do a piece of work. They don't get to take 3 months off and not do that work or not deliver at all. So and because it impacts the entire organization. So we found from really burning ourselves through those kind of things, we found, okay, the language that we're using for our community that has been with us for a long time, or our staff that are under our care and that have had their have helped build Chen, it does not work for short-term relationships. So you'll see in the document that I shared about what it's like to work at Chen, we make it really clear about what people how different roles fit within the larger structure of Chen. So again, for me, transparency is key. For some people, some of that stuff is not going to work, and that's completely fine. I just think, I don't think it's up to me as a leader to make space for everybody. That is not my job. It's also not my job to benefit anybody who wants to economically benefit from working from Chen. My job is to create a fair feminist working environment, which will work for some people, and the people that it works for, they should really come, and I would do my best to accommodate them. But it is not my job to be the organization or person for everybody. And I think that was the biggest feminist leadership lesson for me. And it's something I tell our project managers as well, because they've had those same experiences where people took advantage of that trust that we placed in them. So we learned how to we trust people, but we've learned how to make sure that we're also protecting ourselves, because when someone doesn't live up to what they've promised, somebody has to pick up that work. And then that's not fair to that person. So think again, this is the collective care approach requires us to think about how we are not individuals. We are in a system that is interconnected. So people, when we extend care to each other, we have to hold ourselves accountable to that, because when we don't do the things in the way that we should, and we leave a lot of space for things like, you know, people being triggered at work, vicarious trauma, people having personal life, all we make account. I'm saying after accounting for all of that, still that line that needs to be drawn for me has shown me that I can create space for sharing power once I make those lines really clear. So that was the hard lesson for me.
Yeah, super helpful. I think what was coming up for me, and I was going to start with where the challenge was first, because that is sort of where the learning happened. And what I thought, including people in decision making, what I realized was that I'd already sort of created the decisions. Like the decisions had already been made, the important ones anyway. So the things that we were talking about, you know, when managing a program, and you do a strategy planning meeting and you have your pretty sticky notes and all that stuff, and people are doing all of this planning, and we come out with a plan, but the actual plan was already created for communities and people that we engaged at that point. And that became clear to me when when people felt like they weren't really involved when you got to the end, throughout a project. And because we had to go back and ask ourselves, why didn't people feel engaged? What was it that we did wrong? We're asking the questions, we're doing check-ins, but it's because that it had already been created and it had already been developed. And I think Srilata Patliwala creates a really, really, does a lot of writing on this, but she has something that she calls invisible power. And I have really taken that to heart, to think about how do people actually feel like they have the power to be able to make a decision and have all the information they need to be able to make a decision. And that is a very quick way to describe that, but she really focuses on this, and those pieces together have really had me take a step back. That what decisions am I making for people at the outset? And what decisions am I making for my team that I'm only allowing input into certain points? Budget is a really, really good place where I think that sometimes that's already decided. We already have that outlined. And so we're asking questions about activities and things of that sort, but sort of backing it up to those basic levels of where you're starting to create the project and get it off the ground. I think it's really important to have those that need to be in the room at that level. And in terms of transparency, I also, when I was on the board of DVRP, that the meetings were all open to staff. And in the 3 years that I was at this organization, not one meeting, I think one staff person showed up. And as part of, some of the surveys and things we sent out, we asked, why do you not come to these meetings? What is it about it? And they're like, it feels intimidating. It feels incredibly intimidating to show up, to be in these conversations, to not sure what my role is and what I should be doing there. So here we are thinking, oh, we have an open meeting. And so we're creating transparency. They can hear the discussions that are happening, but the space didn't feel really comfortable for staff to show up. And so just rethinking about how do we create spaces where people can show up. Just because we call them safe doesn't make it so. I think somebody in the chat, I think it might have been Lindsay, but somebody talked about consent. And I think that's an incredibly important and basic part of, as we build transparency, as we are talking about accountability and decision-making, that is such a core part of it, and not just assuming consent, which is kind of an irony in our work, right? But it happens all the time. And so I think that I am still learning and thinking of ways of how to do this better, but it's, you know, that was a big learning for me.
Thank you both for also being vulnerable in this space, and also for sharing how you also learn sometimes the hard way, right? By making mistakes and then feeling also that accountability on yourself, that maybe you could have done things differently, or collectively you could have done things differently. I think here what you were also reflecting upon in terms of that there needs to be like a basis of trust, but also when it comes to power and decision making, that's clear structures and agreements upfront can really help in also upholding kind of that mutual trust that is there. And Priya, something I think you mentioned it earlier on in the conversation already, when it comes to power and decision making as well, like how also sometimes small acts of claiming power and doing the things you can do from the position where you are in can really make a big difference. So I think also kind of weaving it towards the end of this conversation, I think that also kind of leaves me hopeful that even though we are all trying and learning and failing sometimes, that is also all part of becoming better and becoming a more feminist space. So thanks for that as well. And I also saw some things in the chat that really resonates, that doing feminist project management and feminist leadership is really complex. So I think kind of taking the space and creating time to reflect on this collectively and having these types of conversations more often really also helps in doing things better in that sense. So I think we touched upon a lot of different things during this conversation, and also really practical and hands-on examples, which also leaves me again inspired. So thank you for that, Priya and Hera, and also to everyone in the audience for co-creating this space with us and for having those rich conversations in the chat and also sharing those learnings. I think soon we will also share the link to our learning brief in the chat. And we really can't wait to hear your thoughts on this as well. So I think after this call, like in a few days, we will also share an email with some ways to stay in touch and keep the conversation going. So please feel invited to do so as well. I think if anything, today really reiterated the importance of a feminist approach to project management. And we hope that the learning brief will help start you reflect on your own practices, on your organizational practices, and to think about ways to managing projects differently, regardless of the context or the position you are in. I was thinking maybe a nice way to wrap up the conversation before handing back over to Iris is maybe to collectively define a bit more what feminist project management is. I think Laura already fairly raised at the start of this event that we don't have a clear definition of what feminist project management is. But I think throughout these conversations, we get more tools and language to define it. So I would also like to invite the audience to put their thoughts on this in the chat, kind of as a final reflective question of this event. And maybe we can do a round with the four of us to close it off as well. I can share some first thoughts, even though it's not a clear-cut definition. But I think what Hera was saying about integrity and transparency really stuck with me. And also in terms of how you then intentionally apply that to the different elements of project management, I think for me is really key in kind of co-creating a feminist project. So maybe I can hand over to Priya.
I'm so sorry. I was typing in the chat as you asked the question, catching up on all of these incredible comments. Do you want us to comment on just final reflections of the event?
Yeah, yeah, just final reflections and a bit of how you would define Feminist Project moving onwards as well.
Yeah, I think that there's all these really big complex words, right? When we think about transparency and accountability, and there's so much in all of them. But to me, I just think about survivor and people-centered approaches. I know that probably is also not simple in and of itself. But when I think about working in feminist project management, I think about who it's going to impact and who it's going to affect. The project isn't just, the work that I do isn't just going to be for me, but it's going to be impacting a person, people, communities. And so thinking about it in a human-centered way, about how do we engage everybody that it's going to impact? How do we ensure that they all have a say and feel heard in the process that is happening? And how can the outcome also be held by the people that it's impacting? There's so much power in that, and the team and an organization should not be the ones to carry that. And so that's really how I think about the process. And I just appreciate you all creating this space. Thank you.
Hera, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I think this is a difficult question in terms of coming up with, like I said in the chat, coming up with a universal definition is hard. I can only talk about what it is to me. And for me, and like how I've crafted it at Chen, in consultation with our community, it's really looking at our organizational values, which are being survivor-centered, trauma-informed, open by default, generous, and inclusive. And then our design principles, which are safety, agency, equity, privacy, hope, accountability, plurality, and power sharing. And just to say, I think hope is a really important, and generosity and hope for me are very important, because I found that these are the two values in a cross-cultural setting are the ones that are the strength of a community. It is being investing in each other's learning, giving each other space to make mistakes and to learn together, and to have, the hope for abundance in a scarce world. Those are the really powerful values to show up in an organization, and also for organizations to design work around, because it is the fuel that we need for our movements to grow.
Shall I go last? I was just going to say that, yeah, thank you so much for coming, everyone. I still feel like I really can't get a handle on what feminist project management is. I think, as I said at the beginning, I'm quite reflective, so I need to go away and think about it a lot more. But this conversation has been incredible. And I think, yeah, we've got some really practical examples as well as a much wider framework to think about. So yeah, thank you so much for everyone. And shall I hand over to Iris for final comments? I think, yeah.
Thank you so much, Laura, and special thank you to Priya, Yana, and Hera for this incredible conversation. What I'm taking away today is a reminder that feminist work is the work of the imagination. And a lot of our experimentation is about building worlds that don't exist and building practices that truly embody our values and create spaces for us to flourish in our diversity. And I'm so grateful that through our conversation today, you've provided such tangible, practical examples of what that can look like in the context of project management. So thank you to the four of you, and thank you to everyone on this call for journeying with us, for thinking with us, for deepening with us, for stretching us and challenging us. And we're really looking forward to continuing to build community and keeping in touch. Lucky will share in the chat some ways that we can keep in touch with each other. COFEM we have a website, we have a LinkedIn page, we're on Twitter at COFEM_eval. And if you're interested in joining our network as well, we've included a link where you can submit a query to join COFEM. But with all of that said, truly my job is to thank all of you today for spending time with us. What a journey, what an honor, and what a privilege it has been to be together in this space today. Thank you for gracing us with 4 minutes of your time. And we hope that you will have a lovely day further. For those who are in the latter parts of your day, we hope the rest of your evening will be restful, and we look forward to keeping in touch. Thank you very much, everyone, and take care.